Hans waited anxiously alongside his brother as they stood by the large stone fountain just outside of the port. "Where are they?" Hans whispered quietly, prompting Lars to look around. "Oh, I'm sure they'll be here soon," the elder brother replied. "Patience is key here." Hans shook his head. "No, Ingrid and Anders are never late. They should be here by now," the prince said with confidence. Both Hans and Lars tensed up as they heard a quiet voice speak up from behind them. "He's right. We're never late." The two brothers quickly took a step forward before turning around to see royal officers Ingrid and Anders, although Hans could hardly recognize them without their armor. Instead, both officers were dressed in worn, tattered clothes with dirt-stained cloaks. "Don't sneak up on me like that," Hans whispered sternly. "What are you two doing anyways?" Anders laughed boastfully. "We had to make sure that we blended in, right?" he said in a voice just as loud as his laugh. Lars grabbed Hans' shoulder. "These two are supposed to be royal guards?" he asked quietly. Hans looked over to Ingrid and Anders, who were now inspecting the holes in their tunics. "Believe it or not, they are the best of the best." Lars looked toward the two guards in disbelief. "I don't know about this, little brother," he said. "Trust me," Hans responded. "These two like to have fun, but that's because Queen Elsa trusts them and Commander Reynolds more than anyone else." "Well, what about you?" Lars questioned his little brother. "Me?" Hans asked. "I think the more help that we can get, the better. It's our responsibility to help the queens find out what they need to know." "Hey," Ingrid called out. "Are you two ready to go?" Did he say responsibility? Lars thought to himself as he and his brother guided the two royal guards through the populated marketplace and toward the direction that the elderly fisherman had pointed them. The group weaved their way through the dense crowd of townspeople who were all going about their daily business. They made sure to keep their faces shrouded by the hoods of their cloaks as they periodically passed by groups of guards positioned throughout the streets. As they walked, Hans leaned over to his brother and said, "I don't remember all of these soldiers hanging around here, do you?" Lars responded quickly while still trying to seem as natural as he could as they walked through the streets toward the middle of Weselton. "No, the guards usually don't patrol this area until after they've made their rounds. Something's not right." "Ingrid, Anders," Hans whispered back to the two guards. "Be on your toes." "Already walking on 'em, kid," Anders responded, followed by a slight chuckle. Did he just laugh at his own joke? Lars asked Hans. "Are you sure that these two—" he started to say before he was cut off by Officer Anders. "Calm down, older Hans," he said. "We know what's about to happen." The group continued to walk a bit before Anders commanded, "Take this next left." "Left?" Lars questioned. "But that's not going to—" "Trust us," Ingrid said calmly. "Take this left." The two brothers followed Ingrid and Anders' directions and made their way down a small pathway which seemed to cut between a group of buildings. The group trekked deeper down the pathway until they reached an intersection that met in the middle of the stone buildings. That was when Lars prompted Hans and the rest of the group to stop. Up ahead on the path straight in front of them stood a pair of fully uniformed Weselton Guards. They were looking directly at Hans. Hans slowly began breathing deeper and deeper as he looked to the pathways that led to either side of him and noticed that there were now pairs of guards standing at both ends. "Ingrid, Anders, what do we do?" Hans asked with a quiver in his voice. "Just relax, kid," Anders said. "We're gonna be just fine as long as you do exactly what we say." "They're here for you two, so if we don't move, they'll have to come to us, limiting their mobility in these tight spaces," Ingrid began saying. "Especially if the doofuses decide to walk shoulder to shoulder," Anders added. "When they get close enough, we'll give you a signal," Ingrid continued. "And as soon as we do, you two follow us through the alley on the right, okay?" The reassurance of their safety had clearly calmed Hans down, who now turned his attention to Lars, and with a smile on his face he said, "I told you they were good." "Yeah, but there's one problem with their plan. We are surrounded by guards," Lars replied. "It doesn't matter which path we take, we won't get through." Lars barely finished his sentence before each group of guards began walking down the alley toward the intersection in the middle. "You there!" one of the guards yelled as he pointed at Hans and Lars. "The Duke has some questions for you." The Weselton Guards continued to advance toward Hans and the group when all of a sudden the young prince heard the sound of metal scraping on a rough surface. "What's that?" Hans exclaimed as he turned his attention back toward Ingrid and Anders. Anders held a small blade in his right hand and what looked like a thin dark gray rock in his left. He continued to strike the blade against the stone, creating a small spark each time it made contact. Hans' eyes followed a single cluster of sparks as it flew away from the stone and toward a small sphere that Ingrid was holding beneath it. The sparks ignited what Hans knew was a fuse. "That's the signal," Ingrid stated with a smile on her face. The lit fuse started to hiss as the flame slowly burned it away. Ingrid tossed the orb directly above them into the sky, and as soon as it left her hand, she and Anders charged directly toward the guards that were advancing down the alley to the right of their group. They managed to take 3 steps before a loud explosion went off in the sky above them, and a veil of smoke rained down into the intersecting alleyways. Hans and Lars didn't have any time to waste. The 2 princes started running down the same alley that the 2 royal guards had charged down. As the 2 brothers continued forward blindly through the smoke, they expected to run into Ingrid, Anders, and the pair of Weselton Guards, but to Hans' surprise, they made it out into the clear air of the street without bumping into anyone. They frantically looked around in search of Elsa's guards when Lars noticed them standing in another alley across from the one they had just escaped from. Anders was signaling for the brothers, who quickly ran over to them. "What happened to the guards?" Hans asked. "Don't worry about them," Ingrid responded. "They're just sleeping it off. Now we need to keep moving toward the center of town. The smoke won't distract them for long." Hans looked over to his brother, who was still catching his breath. "See, I told you that they knew what they were doing." Lars laughed through his heavy breathing before the group quickly began sprinting between the buildings. They did everything they could to stay out of sight as they cautiously made their way deeper into Weselton toward the former ship captain's house. Despite the brisk pace that Hans and his companions were moving, about an hour had passed before they successfully maneuvered around the guards that now seemed to be scouring every inch of Weselton. But eventually, Hans could see the ruins of a crumbled stone building. He pointed to a small wooden house that was 2 buildings away from the rubble. "That must be it." "Hold on, how do we know that's the right house?" Anders asked. Lars answered before Hans could. "The instructions that the fisherman gave us was to follow the road into the center of town and keep walking until we see a building that was recently destroyed. According to him, Captain Arthur's home could be found 2 houses past it." Lars then pointed in the opposite direction of the house that they were focusing on. "And since the sea is back that way, as Hans said, that one must be Arthur's." "Good enough for me," Ingrid nodded. Anders smiled at the 2 princes. "I agree. So, how do we proceed then?" "What?" Hans replied. "Are you asking us?" he said as he pointed to himself and his brother. Ingrid and Anders both nodded as Ingrid responded by saying, "It's your job, kid. We're just here to make sure you stay alive and on course." Everyone stopped talking for a second as they leaned around the corner and scanned the street from right to left. "It looks like we're still clear, so just tell us where you want us and we'll be there." Lars looked at the royal guards and then over to his little brother. "They really put a lot of trust into him, don't they?" he thought to himself. "So, what should we do, Hans?" Lars asked. Hans was taken aback for a second, but then responded confidently. "I think we should all be there to hear what the captain has to say." "Wait," Anders replied. "Shouldn't Ingrid and I keep watch in case of trouble?" "No, that won't be necessary," Hans answered. "The streets are clear right now, so the Weasel's guards won't have any idea where we're hiding if we're behind closed doors. Plus, when the guards do patrol this way, we don't want to risk them spotting you around the captain's house and discovering who we were looking for." Hans looked over to Lars to ask him how he felt about the plan, but he didn't have to say a word when he saw the big, expressive smile on his older brother's face. "All right then," Ingrid said. Everyone leaned out of the alleyway and looked up and down the street for any signs of guards. "Let's get going." The group made their way out of the alley and walked as casually as they could toward the ship captain's house. Hans was the first one to the door, and he reached his hand out and got ready to knock when he felt a pair of hands push him forward from behind. "Guards!" Lars whispered as he pushed past Hans and reached for the door handle. The wooden door creaked as it swung open, and the group wasted no time stepping through the threshold into the dimly lit wooden house. Anders closed the door behind them. As he turned around to face the rest of the room, the first thing he noticed was that Hans had his arms raised in the air. Anders leaned to the left a little and looked past the young prince. His eyes grew wide as he noticed a tall, burly-looking bald man with a long dark beard that was covered in knots. The royal guard quickly raised his hands in the air as soon as he noticed the large curved sword that the man had placed less than an inch from Hans' face. "Mind telling me why you're in my house?" the large man said calmly. Hans' eyes crossed to focus on the tip of the blade. A single droplet of sweat rolled down the side of his face, and he took a deep breath before responding, "We're looking for answers."